With no special equipment and basically just a kitchen oven, Steve from Smoke Trails BBQ made this tender, barky brisket that I have to try for myself. And although his recipe is super simple and easy to follow, he had a few tricks up his sleeve, which I think are brilliant. Like this secret ingredient, a mysterious black powder that adds an incredible dark color to the bark of the finished brisket. Thanks to Steve's simple homemade barbecue rub, which includes this magical powder. But before we get there, let's get this brisket prepped. And today I will be cooking a prime grade brisket, which is the highest grade you can buy according to the USDA scale. This just means it has a high amount of intramuscular fat, which should keep the brisket nice and juicy during this long, low and slow cook. But if you're following along at home and you don't have access to a prime grade brisket, just buy the highest grade you can. Trust me, it'll be fine. Now, while I'm trimming this brisket so that the fat cap is down to a uniform 1/4 inch thickness, I need to let you know that I will be altering Steve's recipe slightly. This is my 3rd video in this indoor brisket series, so I just want to apply some of the knowledge that I've gained from the various recipes I've tried. And also, Steve posted his original recipe nearly 3 years ago, so I'm sure he'll appreciate the updates I'm going to introduce. Or at least I hope. And if you want to see the original recipe, just watch his video, which as always will be linked in the description below. However, one aspect I will definitely not change from his recipe is the cure, which Steve calls for 1/4 cup of curing salt mixed into a gallon of water. And although this doesn't look like it will add much to this recipe, this curious pink powder has a huge effect on the final results of the finished brisket. Curing salt or prog powder like I have here has sodium nitrite, which when broken down during the cooking process, binds with the myoglobin in the meat, turning it pink. A very similar effect occurs when you barbecue meat in a smoker. The nitric oxide from the burning wood reacts with the myoglobin in the meat, giving it that trademark pink ring instead of a well done brown. As such, we can use this effect from the curing salt to emulate a real wood fire smoke ring in the brisket. Steve's recipe calls for a 2-hour stay for the brisket in the curing salt bath to achieve this smoke ring effect, which is about the same amount of time recommended by Chef Steps in their sous vide brisket recipe I tried a few weeks back. And based on my results of that Chef Steps brisket, I can attest that 2 hours is the perfect amount of time for the cure. After 2 hours, I went ahead and dried the brisket with some paper towels, and this brisket is ready for the seasoning. And not just any seasoning, because it's time to use the Smoke Trails BBQ secret ingredient, which is charcoal powder. So this is food grade coconut shell activated charcoal powder. And like I said, this stuff is incredibly black. It stains very easily, so you really do not need a whole lot for this recipe. Unfortunately, Amazon sells this powder by the half pound, so now I have enough to last me an entire lifetime. But on the bright side, these bags are relatively cheap at about $8 on Amazon. So if you want to try out this recipe at home, I'll have a link to this and all the other ingredients I use in this recipe in the description box. So Steve's brisket rub is a very simple Texas style recipe. To a shaker bottle or a bowl, just add 1/3 cup of kosher salt, 1/3 cup of coarse pepper, and a teaspoon of the charcoal powder. As you can see, with just a little bit of charcoal powder, this rub is incredibly black, which I hope will make this brisket bark look like it was smoked in a barbecue pit. But before we add the rub to this brisket, Steve uses Colgan Hickory Smoke Seasoning as a binder. And you can find this smoke seasoning at most Walmarts, but I need to add emphasis on the term smoke seasoning, because this is different than liquid smoke concentrate, like this one from Wright's. Smoke seasoning is diluted with water, molasses, and other ingredients, so it's not nearly as potent as liquid smoke concentrate. But if you only have access to the concentrate, you can just dilute it yourself to a ratio of about 1 tablespoon of liquid smoke to 1 cup of water or marinade. And this is the only smoke flavor Steve adds in the entire recipe. So I'm curious to see if this is going to be enough to emulate a real smoke flavor that you'd get if you barbecued the brisket. But I'll be sure to let you know when I taste the brisket at the end for myself. Once the binder is on, coat both sides of the brisket and the edges with the charcoal rub, and this brisket is ready for the oven. Steve sets his oven to 275 degrees Fahrenheit and cooks his brisket on a wire rack for 4 to 6 hours or until the internal temperature reaches 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it reaches that internal temperature, Steve wraps his brisket in butcher paper. I'm cooking my brisket at 275 degrees Fahrenheit as well. However, I will not cook my brisket to 165 degrees Fahrenheit internal like Steve did, for a very important reason. From my experience, one of the telltale signs of a rookie brisket can actually be tasted in the final product. If you're eating a brisket and it kind of has a pot roasty taste, then in almost every case, the brisket was wrapped too early. When cooking a brisket in an oven or a smoker, when the internal temperature reaches between 150 degrees to around 170 degrees Fahrenheit, the brisket experiences the stall. This slows down the cooking process and in some cases even halting it altogether. To get past the stall, you can do what Steve does in his recipe, which is also called the Texas Crutch, which is simply wrapping the brisket in either butcher paper or foil. The wrapped brisket will cook more rapidly, helping it get past the stall before the inside of the brisket dries out completely. However, the problem with using the Texas Crutch is if you wrap the brisket too early, the brisket still has plenty of moisture to release. And those juices in the brisket release in the wrap, sort of braising the brisket as it finishes cooking. This causes the brisket to have a much stronger beef flavor, making it taste more like a pot roast than a smoked brisket. Now, figuring out when it's time to wrap the brisket is a skill that takes experience, and since every brisket has a different amount of water, intramuscular fat, collagen, etc., in some cases, a brisket can in fact be ready to wrap at 165 degrees Fahrenheit, like Steve suggests. But in most cases, it won't be. And because a lot of you don't have a lot of experience with brisket to know exactly when the appropriate time is to wrap, I'm gonna give you a trick that's virtually bulletproof. Just let the brisket keep cooking past the stall until the internal temperature gets to around 170 to 175 degrees Fahrenheit before wrapping it. 99% of the time when following this method, your finished brisket will not have a pot roast taste. Instead, the crust will have a salty, savory, and somewhat sweet taste to it. That is a trademark of a well-cooked brisket. And the added benefit of allowing the brisket to push past the stall is you can actually use foil if you don't have butcher paper. However, since I do have butcher paper, I will use it just like Steve did. And also per Steve's recipe, I put the brisket back in the oven and hiked up the temperature to 325 degrees Fahrenheit and cooked it until the internal temperature of the brisket was around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. However, I am going to deviate from Steve in this next step, which is called the rest. So once his brisket finished, Steve placed it on the counter and let it rest for 2 hours before slicing into it. But in my opinion, I would advise against this. So the brisket I'm cooking today was 16 pounds, and if I followed Steve's recipe to a T, this brisket would have finished in like 6 to 7 hours from start to finish. Now, because the brisket I cooked was pretty large, the odds are that after only 6 to 7 hours of cooking, the connective tissues and the collagen in the brisket hasn't completely broken down yet. So to give the brisket additional time to ensure that everything is broken down and nice and jiggly, I suggest resting the brisket for much longer than 2 hours. I let both the brisket and the oven cool down for about an hour before placing it in my recalibrated oven at 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I let the brisket rest overnight for a total rest time of about 8 hours. But if you're using a choice or select grade brisket, just go for a total rest time of about 4 hours to prevent it from drying out. And many hours later, this brisket is finally done. But before I slice into this, I need to go over a few notes that I noticed while I was cooking this that I just think are gonna be really helpful if you wanted to try this recipe at home. The first thing is that this thing cooked way longer than the 4 to 6 hours that Steve suggested in his recipe. Mine hit the internal of 165 degrees Fahrenheit after the 7-hour mark, and it didn't get to the 170s to 175s until after 9 hours. So if your brisket is much bigger or much smaller than the 16-pound brisket I cooked today, then just know that your times will vary, but with that, just go off of the internal temperatures, not so much the time. And because this brisket cooked way longer than I anticipated, it finished a lot later than I thought at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I really did not give this brisket a lot of time to rest on the counter before putting it back into the oven to rest. So it may be a little overcooked, but from the things that I saw before I wrapped this brisket, I think it's gonna turn out amazing. But there's only one way to find out, so let's open this thing up and see how it turned out. Okay, so first and foremost, let's talk about this bark. Oh my gosh, it is so dark. I seriously wouldn't be able to tell the difference between this and an offset brisket. I don't know if the camera truly captures how amazing this bark is. That charcoal powder went so far with this recipe. So the brisket is definitely overcooked. The point is basically falling apart, and one side of the brisket on the flat end actually got pretty crispy at the bottom, and it was just kind of flaking away. So when I end up trying my recipe, I think I'm gonna go with a lower temperature because, again, I think it's really important to push the brisket past the stall before you wrap it. But seriously, if you gave this to anybody and told them it was a smoked brisket, like, how would they be able to tell the difference? Well, there is one way that someone would know. It's by tasting it, because just from the smell, I do not smell much smoke flavor from this brisket, but let's find out if it tastes smoky. So this is the best indoor brisket recipe that I've cooked on this channel so far. Just from the presentation alone, the bark is like on another planet in comparison to the chef set brisket and the that dude can cook brisket. And with that, there's really not a lot of smoke flavor here. It does have a hint of a smoke flavor, but it tastes more like when you cook a whole brisket and then you save the leftovers in the fridge for a couple of days and then you try to microwave it after. So the chef steps brisket definitely had way more smoke flavor than this brisket. And you can watch the video where I tried out Chef Steps brisket recipe, which is on your screen right now. I'll see you guys over there.